Hi, this is Dan Marek from Ruby Culinary School. I'm the Director of Plant-Based Culinary and Development, and we're going to be doing our office hours, or Ask Me Anything, cooking related, and where you can actually submit any of the questions that you'd like, and I'll answer them. To be able to do this, all you have to do is be logged into the Ruby platform, and you'll see in the top right-hand corner of this live event, there's an Add Question Here box. Just type your question and hit the Add button. If you see one of the other questions below that you like or like to upvote to be able to get answered quickly, just hit the heart icon on the side of the question, and it'll give you a vote to be able to bring it to the top of the queue. So this open platform is basically where you can ask chefs anything about cooking related to be able to help you on your journey. Because I am the director of plant-based culinary, I try to focus mostly plant-based areas, but can answer outside of that spectrum a little bit. So welcome, and let's get started and dig right in. Our first question is, hi chef, I see many vegan pesto recipes substituting cheese with nutritional yeast and lemon. However, I find these flavors to be quite overpowering, even when I don't use that much of them. Do you have any good alternatives? Would miso or tahini work? That's a great question. So I make pesto quite often. And traditionally, pesto is basically made from grinding basil leaves with pine nuts, a little bit of Parmesan, oil, garlic, and salt. Now, being that we're looking for a vegan version, I actually switched this up quite a bit to be able to do the version that I do. I actually do half spinach. That way I'm getting more micronutrients in from the spinach and some of the qualities that spinach has into it. I typically don't use pine nuts all the time. I will, but not all the time, just because they're quite pricey. I actually find walnuts actually as a really good um, difference for those to be able to use walnuts instead. So those are some of the switches that I do right away. Now, I don't typically put nutritional yeast into the pesto that I make, so I would probably leave that out. When it does come to the acid, though, I do recommend putting the lemon juice in. You can use different kinds of acids, but the nice thing about that, it kind of makes a brighter, kind of more lighter flavor to it. Now, if you don't want a lot of lemon juice, you can just add a little bit into it as well. Um, and the great thing about pesto is you'll see a lot of different varieties of it now too. So if you want to add something like tahini or miso to it, that would actually work. It would give it, just a little bit more umami to it. So it would kind of replace that cheese-ish kind of tanginess you're looking for, or that, yeah, that other flavor profile. Now, looking at that, you can also switch up the herbs. So I've seen a lot of different things like cilantro pesto or people doing an arugula pesto. So it just kind of looks at it in a different flavor profile. So if you're looking to switch up your pesto, those are probably some of the best recommendations I would give. If you're looking to lighten up on the lemon juice, that's totally okay, and you can leave the nutritional yeast completely out if you'd like to. For those of you who are wondering, the nutritional yeast is usually added to be able to add a bit of a cheesy flavor and add that umami in. So something like miso or tahini would actually be a really nice alternative to be able to make that work. So great question. Marilyn, I have finished making two soups, the Chilean bean stew and the savory squash soup. They look great but don't taste great at the end. I think this is where the finishing salt comes in, but also salt is all I know how to use. What tips do you have? That's a great question, Marilyn. I don't know the exact recipes that you're talking about there, but it sounds like you're just not getting quite the flavor that you're looking for. Now, finishing salt is typically something you put on kind of after the fact when you're plating the dish, and it's just something when you first put it into your mouth, you're getting those salt crystals on the top to be able to enhance the flavor off of it. I'm not a big believer in adding a lot of salt to dishes to be able to get the main flavors out. What I would highly recommend is making sure that you're using ingredients that are in season or that are grown close to you, because they're going to have a lot more flavor. If you think about something like a tomato, if you're eating it in season, can really help you understand the flavor profiles of eating something in season. So if you're eating a tomato in the middle of September, when tomatoes are in season typically, um, you'll be able to bite into that tomato and it's going to taste just like a tomato, like full flavored, really big tomato flavor. But if you say get a tomato in the middle of December, not many places tomatoes are, in season at that time. So what's happening is somebody's picking that tomato off the vine. It's starting to start to decompose at that moment, so it's losing its nutrients, its vitamins, and its flavor. And then it has to travel, depending on where you live, quite a long ways. Depending on if you're in the United States, if you're, say, getting a tomato in Maine, it's going to be quite a while to be able to get from where they're growing those. Typically 7 to 10 days if they're getting them from lower Mexico. Now there are some other ways to be able to look at that as far as getting some hydroponic varieties, which are grown indoors and can be grown almost any time of the year, which is really nice. Those still have a lot of that big full flavor in it. So when you're making these soups, kind of think of that and keep that in mind. The more flavorful, the more flavorful you want it, the more in season ingredients you can have for that. So picking those ingredients that are in season, giving you a lot more flavor will help. The other thing I actually would add for this is making sure that you're using uh, like fresh seasonings, like say like thyme or dill or something like that. If you're using something like that into it, if you're adding a fresh herb, it's actually going to add a ton more flavor to your dish without the salt added, which is great. Now, of course, you're going to have to use less of the fresh herb than you would for a dried ingredient. And a lot of times they say to use dried for soups because it's sitting and it's simmering for a while. So a lot of that flavor will be extracted out there. But if you're using, you can even do a combination. But if you're using just a little bit of that fresh herb, especially on the finish, like you'd use your finishing salts, you're going to get a lot more pop of flavor to be able to come out of those. Something else I'd like to recommend, if it didn't already have it in that stew, you might want to add just a touch of something like maybe a champagne vinegar or a vinegar or lemon juice to it, just to be able to give a lightness and a brightness to that soup as well. So those would probably be the best ways I would say to be able to kind of, get the bigger flavors coming out of those soups without seeing the recipes right away, but using really ingredients that are in season, that are canned in season, and then also using fresh herbs when available. I hope that helps, Marilyn. All right, another one from Marilyn. When making your own vegetable stock, what would be the proportion of vegetable to water? Any other tips? So that depends on the stock that you're doing. Typically, with my normal stock that I make every week, I usually save all the trimmings from onions and the peels from carrots and the cores of red peppers and things like that. So I'll have like a bag that I keep in my freezer that I just fill up with all these different vegetable scraps. Now, of course, you can just make a stock, and add the full ingredients in your mirepoix, and it would be great. But I just look at it as a way to keep things economical and to be able to save money a little bit. So I basically freeze all my scraps and put them into the bag like that. Now, when I'm done with that, I put it into a stock pot. I put my water level just above where the vegetables are, and then bring it to a boil and then down to a simmer. And I usually do it for about an hour and 20 minutes, sometimes longer if I want to reduce it. Now, the reason I'm doing that is I'm actually putting the water right above the vegetables because I know that I'm going to get more flavor out of everything that's in that as well. Now, you could go with a much bigger, much larger amount of water if you wanted to. So you could go twice as much as the top, but then it's not going to be as concentrated of a flavor. So you can totally do that if you'd like to. I just like to be able to get the concentrated flavors out of those. So I keep them lower and then I'll strain off afterward. Now, on another example, though, so something like dashi, which is typically I'll make it with dried shiitake mushrooms, a little bit of kombu, maybe a little bit of ginger or turmeric in it as well too, and bring that again to a boil and then down to a simmer. I'm going to have barely any kind of vegetable or anything into it as I kind of start, and it's going to be a lot more of the liquid to be able to go. So it's almost kind of like a tea, like steeping a tea instead. But again, I'm doing that. It has a much lighter flavor, and it's not as a big, robust, pop of flavor because there's a lot more water than there are in the ingredients to be able to soak down into it. Now, of course, you can keep reducing the liquid down in the stock and it'll get more and more concentrated. But it really depends on the soup or the stock you're trying to do. Much bigger flavors, a lot more vegetable, a lot less water. If you want it to be a much lighter flavor, a little bit more water. Now, these are also something you can do. If you make the more concentrated version, you can actually add water to it after it's cooled to be able to get a lighter flavor out of it as well, and strain it off to make sure you're not getting any particles of the vegetables into it as well. I hope that helps, Marilyn. All right, our next question here is I'm having a tough time roasting peppers as a side dish on a pan. Um, uh, oh no, a tough time roasting potatoes for a side dish on a pan. Russet, unlike fingerling, is pretty hard to get properly roasted in a pan as it sticks. Do you have any technique for pan roasting well cooked potatoes? Oven roasting takes too long. So I actually use a combination of cooking when I do this. When I do potatoes, if you're going to do like a nice baked potato or something like that, I'll usually take the potato like a russet and I'll boil it for a little bit first, but I'm not going to boil it so it's all the way cooked through. I'm going to start to boil it, and then just when I can put my fork into it, kind of through the skin easily, but not all the way into it all the way. That's actually when I'm going to take it out of the boiling water and then put it onto a sheet pan. Now, I typically will just do a light spray on the outside of cooking oil, but you don't have to do that. You can also just put it right under your sheet pan at about 350 degrees for about 20 minutes. And that way, what you end up getting is a really nice kind of, the inside is really soft and the outside is nice and extra crispy, which is wonderful. The spray oil definitely helps with getting the crispiness on it. But if you put your convection oven settings on, if you have one, and then continue to flip it around if you don't, you'll get a lot of that same effect. So that's typically the way that I like to do, like the baked potatoes like that in the russet style. Um, I'll boil them first, get the inside just slightly soft, and then crisp up the outside by putting them in the oven at a higher temperature. It works out really, really well. Now, other ways to be able to cook potatoes, if you're saying you don't like to roast the potatoes as well, boiling is always one of those easy things to do. You can also cook them in a saute pan, but you can't do that whole. You'd have to cut them up a little bit more to be able to make sure that you're getting the heat to penetrate through those potatoes. I hope that helps. Gina, how do you feel about plant-based meats? Well, I think what you're talking about is the alternative meats, things like you can buy in the store that are made to replicate like meats, something like a Beyond Burger or the Ultimate Burgers. There are also different kinds of chicken patties and things like that you can get. And I'm not the hugest fan of them, to tell you the truth. I think they serve a purpose, for what they are. In fact, I've talked with the owner and the guy who started Impossible, and he said that vegans are actually not the market that they're looking for. They're more looking for people who are looking to consume less meat and kind of switch over to eating more plant based. So their number one goal was to replicate the flavor and texture of meat. So the first time I bit into an Impossible Burger, I actually had to take a step back because after more than 20 years of being plant based, it tasted so much like meat it repulsed me a bit. Um, and that's not for everybody, but that's just the way it was for me. Now, the alternative, like chickens and stuff like that, they're totally okay too. But the thing about them, the reason I'm not the biggest fan of them is they are super duper processed, and they're just overly processed. So you end up getting an ingredient label on the back that looks really, really long and full of things that are really hard to even pronounce. And things I always say, if your great grandmother couldn't pronounce an ingredient or know what it is in the back of a box, you should put it back. And a lot of those alternative meats have things like that. So what I do is I tend to go for alternative meats that are more whole food plant based. So I'll use things like mushrooms to make an alternative chicken, like a maitake mushroom, or I'll do shredded mushrooms or jackfruit to be able to do like a pulled pork or something like that. Now that's basically what I'm doing is taking the mushroom and using that as the texture of the meat, and then adding the other spices and ingredients to be able to get it into the same flavor profile. So if I'm going to do a shredded like pork out of a mushroom, I would add like a barbecue sauce or something to that to be able to cook it down into. And that way, you're actually still getting the whole food aspect of it, and you can add the sauce to it and make the sauce any way you want to. You can do the no oil route on it, or you can, skip a lot of the other things that might be, a lot of those, like the breadings on those chicken things are not always gluten free. So you can do those, in a gluten free version as well, too. There were tons of different recipes to be able to do that. In fact, I even came across Lizzo, the artist, doing fried chicken out of mushrooms the other day that I thought was pretty good. That's kind of my general feelings on plant-based meats. Is the A lot of them are very processed, so I try to stick with the whole food alternatives of those, and just be experimental with them as you go. All right, our next one is from Laura. Hello, Chef Dan. I'm entertaining a few people who are not plant-based for breakfast for a few days. Do you have any suggestions beyond the tofu scramble, oat fruit bowls? I'm going blank, and any inspiration would be wonderful. Thank you. So let's see, breakfast items for people that are not plant based. Now, in that situation, you might actually want to consider some of those alternative plant, meats as well. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of them, but for conversion over, they actually work really well because they taste very familiar to people who are used to eating those meats. So you might even want to try like a little, sausage sandwich or something on you can do them on English muffins or something like that. Do like a little vegan hollandaise. You could actually do a little baked tofu instead of this tofu scramble, and do a little hollandaise over that with your sliced tomato, and on the English muffin or something like that would be a nice one as well. I always see, depending on where you are in the country or where you are in the world, in the South, grits are actually a really wonderful way to be able to start out the day too. So it doesn't, the oat fruit bowl, a little bit different than that, so you're still getting a nice savory element to it. Um, let's see, and beyond the tofu scrambles, yeah, doing the tacos out of tofu scrambles, kind of one of my go-tos for breakfast. It's something I just always love. Now, other things you can look at too are going with some baked goods or maybe pancakes. You can do really nice vegan pancakes, or do cornbreads like that as well too. You can do different kinds of muffins to be able to stretch out a little bit. So those would probably be a couple recommendations I would be able to look forward or look towards. But again, it also depends on how open they are to plant-based eating, because if they're not really open to it, you might want to go with something more of those, meat alternatives. But if they're open to it, have fun with it. Going with like different salads and things for the breakfast times, really nice too. I love to do the dashi, like I was talking about the soup. It's a mushroom style soup. It's actually really, really nice to be able to start out the day and get your metabolism going and get yourself going. So that might be something I might recommend too. Our next question is from Babs. There are so many varieties of rice. How does one determine which variety to use in your dishes? Please explain the difference between jasmine and balsamic. I think that probably basmati is what you meant on that. So yeah, there are a lot of different varieties of rice. And those two that you mentioned, jasmine and basmati, are both long grain rice. They typically are a little more aromatic. Jasmine is something that's typically found in India and surrounding regions. And the basmati is something you kind of find in like Thailand and things like that too. Both of them being a long grain kind of have their own uses for them because they're not sticky. They don't stick together as much unless you put tons of water into them. And they do have a nice floral aromatic, scent to them, which is nice. Now, when to be able to use those? So jasmine, I would typically use when I'm doing something like a Thai dish, and then the basmati I would use if I were doing something like an Indian curry or something like that. Now, there are all kinds of different rices that you would use for different things too. So you can go with a short grain rice if you're doing something like a sushi, or a risotto typically would use a short grain rice too, because they're going to release a lot of those starches. They're going to stick together a little bit more. And then you'll have things like forbidden rice that are kind of like all kinds of different in there too, but they're also kind of a sticky rice too. Just completely different look and nutrient profile too. So there are a lot of different rices out there, and the best thing to be able to do is experiment with them a little bit. Try a couple different varieties and see what you like best. I always recommend going for the brown rice version of something. And, all rice basically starts out with the brown rice. The only difference is they remove that outer hull off the rice, which is where the fiber is in it. So I typically try to keep the brown rice going in that as well too. Now things for like forbidden rice, there's no brown rice version of forbidden rice, but all the other ones that are white, you're always going to have a brown version of that too. So I hope that helps between the difference in jasmine and basmati rice. All right, Estella. Hi, chef. How do I substitute egg in gluten-free pasta? Please, no tofu. So in gluten-free pasta, so yeah, I guess tofu is the one that we typically go for making those. But when I'm doing a gluten-free pasta, I'm typically just using like a water and then the flour mix, and it's usually kind of a variety of mixes of different gluten-free flours. And then if you really need some sort of egg substitute into it, which I typically don't do, um, it might be something like a flax. But quite honestly, I just always use just the actual flour and the water. Make the well, and then roll it on out, and then put it through the pasta machine to be able to make that work. And that's kind of how I do my regular pastas as well. If I'm using semolina or something like that too, I'm just going to use the water and the flour, make it as simple as possible, easy to digest. And I do understand why people use the tofu in their pastas. We, especially with our manicotti that we do for Ruby, there's a tofu mix in that as well too. But quite honestly, I don't think it's needed. It's nice because it gives a different kind of texture to the pasta. But just practicing around with those recipes a little bit is probably the best way to do it. And I see Jan here saying chickpea flour instead of egg is actually, yeah, that's great. And chickpea flour is kind of one of those. I usually use a variety of different flours, and chickpea is typically one of those that I add into it because it does have that nice elasticity to it too. So I hope that helps. And thanks, Jan, for the tip. Gerald, hi, there's a Belgian endive salad near the start of the course. Was just wondering if there's an alternative. Uh, and I'm in Ireland and haven't heard of those before. So Belgian endive should be available in Ireland, but there are some places even all across the world and in the United States where Belgian endive is not an easy thing to find. So what you're looking for is kind of more of a bitter, ingredient, um, uh, bitter greens to it. Like I actually love endive when you like kind of almost grill them and kind of get a deeper flavor out of them. But it's definitely, you're basically looking for something that has kind of a crisp and bitter, flavor profile to that. It does, the flavor's really sharp at first, but then just definitely kind of mellows out a little bit. So there are other things you can use as alternatives. It doesn't have to be endive. There are a lot of bitter vegetables and greens out there that you can use as a substitution. And it, one of the things we do at Ruby is we give you the recommendations on what ingredients to use, but we're also open to you playing with them a little bit and experimenting to be able to see what works. So it doesn't have to be exactly the endive. If you can't find the endive, that's fine. If you it's basically what endive is kind of a small head of lettuce, so and it's just they're usually yellow, and if you can find something similar to that, I think it would work. And cabbage is probably a little too dense for it as well, but something in between like the greens and the cabbage would probably work for that. So not entirely sure the varieties you might be able to find in Ireland, but just know that you can substitute out another bitter, leafy green that you're looking for, if that would help. All right, Randy, what is your best tip for keeping basil, cilantro, etc. fresh? I find I waste because they go bad after just a little bit for a recipe and go bad before I need again. That's actually totally true. That happens all the time for people. My best recommendation is actually to take your herbs that you get from the store, if they're fresh herbs, cut and then treat them like flowers when you get them home. Cut off the very bottom stalks of them, put them into a glass of water, and then take the produce bag you got them in and put them back over the top, and then put them in your refrigerator. I guarantee they're going to last much, much longer than if you're just putting them in the bag in the fridge in your crisper or something like that. So that would probably be the first recommendation, is to treat them like flowers. Cut the bottom off, put them into water, put them into the bag over just loosely over the top so they can still breathe a bit. Now, the other things that you can do is I've seen people, if you're washing them when you first get them home, I typically wash them as I need them. But if you're washing them when you get them home, just make sure to dry them off really well and keep them inside of a paper towel. and then put them into your fridge in that same way. My wife likes to put them into a large kind of baggy thing to be able to put them into. I don't typically do that. I'll just put them into the paper towel to dry them off, and there'll be a little dampness to the paper towel to be able to let that last. Other things that I've seen that actually work really, really well are freezing them. And you can't just put like the whole, batch of, cilantro into the freezer just as it is. What I typically do is I'll put them into a blender, which is a little bit of water, and blend up the herbs and then put them into ice cube trays. And then you can freeze them just like that. And then when you need them, you can take them out of the freezer anytime you want and add them into dishes, and it'll melt down and you'll have those herbs still green, which is wonderful. So those are probably the tips that I would recommend first and foremost is the treating them like flowers, wrapping them in the paper towels, and then freezing them. But I've really found the best results to treat them like flowers. So I hope that helps, Randy. All right, Stella, hi chef. Another question: what's the best way to peel a Japanese pumpkin kabocha? I'm guessing, but yeah, the best way to be able to do that I've found is either, I typically do it with a paring knife, but you can do it a couple different ways. I mean, you can probably do it with um, a good peeler as well. But yeah, typically I use a paring knife when I'm doing it. If you're, yeah, it's a little hard to be able to kind of get into those nooks as well too. But yeah, and a lot of times I'll actually keep the outside squash on, or the outside of that squash on, because it's actually, it's not as rough as some of the other varieties. But a peeler or a paring knife, and I typically use the paring knife. All right, Randy, here's another one: is a cooked bag of riced cauliflower in the microwave, or I cooked a bag of riced cauliflower in the microwave and then forgot about it overnight. I was going to use it in dressings, found it the next morning in the microwave. Would it be safe? I'd probably pass on that. And that's just to be on the safe side. Um, it could be fine, but depending on what other things have been in that microwave, what's been cooked in there could be all kinds of other pathogens and stuff that are in there. So I would probably not do the cauliflower, especially if you're just going to put it into something raw like that. I'd probably start over on that one. Sorry to say, and I'm not saying that you can't do that. I just think for safety's sake, might as well just let it be and try something else on it. Sorry about that, Randy. All right, our next one is: if you're not supposed to reheat rice the next day, but eat it straight out of the refrigerator, is this also true for recipes that contain rice? I've read so much contradictory information on this topic. Yes, I have too. That's, I've seen a lot of people say you're not supposed to reheat rice the next day, but, fried rice, that's typically made out of rice that's the day old, right? So you'll definitely see contradictory information both sides on this. And I don't have, I'm not like really on the one side or the other. I'm definitely more on the fence of that. So not having the expertise in that particular aspect, I would leave you to your own device on that. But I'm right there with you. I've seen, both ways, and I've seen evidence on both sides. So sorry not to be able to answer that one for you. But I typically will reheat it right away, the next day and not have an issue with it as well. But I also eat it if it's cold out of there. But just, as the example, fried rice is typically always made out of day old rice to be able to make that happen. And just making sure to heat those up to be able to get anything out of it as well, too. All right. Pat, I need to source a chef knife to complete my kitchen setup for the Culinary RX program. I'm on a limited budget. Recommendations, please. So, Pat, I tell people this all the time: the best knife you can get is a sharp knife. It doesn't really matter the brand of the knife at all. So, there are a lot of different makers out there. One of the things I always recommend is trying to be able to find a knife where the tang is the full length of the handle as well. Now, it doesn't have to be an expensive knife to do that. And what I mean by the tang is you'll have the blade like this, and then say this is the handle. You'll see a stripe of metal that basically goes through all the way down to the handle and comes to the end as well too. Now I say that because a lot of knives will just have the end of it kind of stuck into the handle, and over time the where those two meet can kind of flex and the blade will come out of it. But if you have a full tang, that doesn't happen. I use a variety of different knives myself. I'm not married to one particular brand. I do use a lot of Wusthof knives, but those are a little on the higher end, depending. They're not above, they might be around the $100 mark, but that's, but there are other knives like the Shun knives that are much more expensive than that. So what I would do is I would recommend going to a culinary store like Sur La Table or a host of other places that let you actually try the knives and then test to see which ones feel right in your hands. um, you know, and then also you can go to other, non-specialty stores that will have knives basically hanging up, and there'll be a plastic guard around the end of them, but you can still feel them in your hand a bit to be able to see how it feels. And you'll also be able to see the full tang. If a knife has a full tang, they don't hide it under plastic or wood or anything. You're typically going to see the metal come around the entire part. So, looking for a nice steel knife, the full tang that feels comfortable in your hand is the best way to go. And then keep it sharp. That's really my best advice for any knife, is to be able to make sure to keep them as sharp as possible. So I don't have a brand specific for you, but experiment a little bit and see how they feel in your hand. So trying to find a place that'll let you, hold them in your hand, and maybe even on a cutting board, like some of the specialty stores do. But if you're going to like a Walmart or a Target or something like that, a lot of times they'll have them hanging, and you can still at least feel the handle on them, and you can actually see if it is a full tang or not. So that probably be my best recommendations for you. You can also go to some of the online stores. There are a lot of different online stores that have knives too, and if it does have a full tang, they will tell you on those too. Hope that helps, Pat. All right. Well, that is actually probably the shortest Ask Me Anything office hours I think we've done. We've gotten through our questions today. So if you do have any follow up questions, you can always email us. Um, I'm easy to email. My email address is dan@ruby.com. And look for more Ask Me Anything office hours in the upcoming future, and you can ask any question you'd like. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a wonderful day.